We're pushing right now is Velvet Elvis. And this is a good book. And what this book did, in going through this, we started realizing that we didn't know too much about Jews, particularly in the time of Jesus. And this guy set us up to start looking at that. And so, what Holly did, we are now in the Jews in the time of Jesus. And this is the book that we're going through now in the bookstore on Tuesday. We'll be really looking at the Maccabees because the Maccabees set up so much of the Jewish religion during the time of Christ. Now, who are the Maccabees? Well, what happened was that, of course, the Greeks had come in and they had taken over Judah and everything. And when Alexander the Great died, the generals started splitting up what he had conquered. And two generals, Ptolemy and Seleucid, Ptolemy took Egypt, and Seleucid took Syria, Mesopotamia, and then came down into Judah. And so we have the Greeks. Now, the Greeks pretty well left the Jews alone. They could keep the Torah and what they had going. They pretty well left them alone. And things were going pretty good until, and I mispronounce a lot of things, so just forgive me, until Articulus IV came in and ruled the Greek. And what he started doing is he started deciding that Judah should become more Greek. And so what he did, he went to the temple and he put up the idols at that time, the Greek idols, he put them up, and he just was going to say everything is going to be Greek. Because he figured he was doing a favor for the Jews by making them a polis, P-O-L-I-S, because that gave them a lot of favor in the Greek things. They didn't have to pay certain taxes and everything. And he thought he did a great job. He started a gymnasium and so on. But the minute he went to the temple and started putting up the idols and whatnot, and he eliminated the Torah. That was it. And at that time, one of the Greek military guys went down and actually, if you have your Bible, and you open it up, there's a map in the back of the Bible, and it has Palestine in the time of Jesus. And one of the things that this Greek soldier, leader did, he went down, and I'm looking at the map on it where it says the Palestine in the time of Jesus. And what he did, he went to a town that was in western Judah, and he went to the priest, whose name was Matthew, and told him that he wanted him, Matthew, to one, eat pork, and two, bow down to the idols that they had. What Matthew did is drew his sword and killed the guy. Right then and there. He then said, all you who believe in what I've done, follow me. And he went out into the hills. Now, Matthew had 5 sons. And the 5 sons followed him, and he had about 200 other people that followed him. And then what happened was that they started then fighting the Greeks. And they did it by guerrilla warfare. And Matthew died after about a year. And before he died, he chose his successor, who was Judah. Judah was the middle son. He chose Judah because he was very good at military. And Judah then became the leader. Now, Judah was called the Hammer. And the hammer in Greek is Maccabees. That's where the name Maccabees came from. So they became the Maccabees. And they started then attacking the Greeks. All the way through, they attacked the Greeks. And what happened then, in that revolt, it started out in 168 BCE and ended in 65. 168 to 65, 100 years. And what they did is, they attacked them so much that Seleucid, the fourth, asked for peace. So they said, okay, they'd take the peace. They'd recognize the king, but they wanted the temple back and everything. So what happened, they went into the temple and cleaned it out. Cleaned out the temple. And when they cleaned out the temple, they had a celebration, a festival. And that festival's name was Hanukkah. Right? And Hanukkah lasted for 8 days. Originally, at Hanukkah, they used bonfires. But in Jesus' time, they used what? Candles. They lit their 8 candles, right?
They used things with oil. They didn't use candles. They
Well,
used vessels with oil.
I'm sorry, you're right. I'm way ahead of my time. They didn't have candles. Oh, that brought up the legend. There's a legend about the oils. Now, when the Greeks came in, they threw out Onas, who was the high priest. And when the Maccabees went in to clean the temple, they found 1 vial of oil. And it was still sealed. So they said, this is still sacred. And they took that oil and they used it to light a candle. And they lasted for what? 8 days. So that's a legend. Thank you. Okay. So the Maccabees came in, and during the Maccabees' time, various things in the Torah, the Jewish, they changed. They changed it, and the one thing they changed was because of Sabbath, the Jews never did anything on Sabbath, right? A day of rest. And all their enemies knew that. So when did they attack the Jews? On Sabbath. Well, during the Maccabees, there was a change. And they looked over the Torah and they said, what we can do on the Sabbath now is we can defend ourselves. Somebody attacks us, we can do what? Defend ourselves. So that was number one thing that changed. There are a couple other changes. Another change was divorce. Divorce. Prior to this, a man could what? Divorce his wife anytime. And those poor women had nothing. What happened with the Maccabees, they brought up a contract that if you were married, in marriage, there was a contract. And again, it was called the Kabuta.
Ketubah.
Ketubah. I'm going to get you up here. Ketubah. And the Ketubah was a contract. And it said if a man divorced his wife, he had to give her at least 200 silver sockets. Yeah, 200 of them. And at least that. And then there were other things. By the way, those contracts are still used this day with some of the Jewish sects. They're still there. So this was very good for the women. Okay? You only have to worry about this one for the first wedding now. That's what it said. And what I read. Okay. The next one, what the heck? All right. So there's another thing though that happened during this time. And that other thing was the resurrection, the bodily resurrection. The Jews did not have that prior to this. Daniel had written that. Daniel was the last prophet to write. And he wrote just before the Maccabees came in. And Daniel has the verse talking about a resurrection, a bodily resurrection. Before that, the Jews did not have that. You went down to S-H-E-O-L, soul, right? You went down to soul, and there you were. And with the resurrection, bodily resurrection, then this came into being during Christ's time too. So that's the Maccabees. He brought in those things. Now, what happened? Well, there were two brothers, two brothers, and they started fighting among themselves. And so who came swooping in and took care of them? The Romans. Right? So in 65, the Romans came in and took over. So this was then what we had going. As far as history that I was going to talk about, because I thought, you know, this set up the Jewish, right? The Jewish, can't call it religion at this time, the Jewish way during the time of Christ. It set it up. And we have that going. Now, after the Maccabees, of course, the Romans came in, and now I'm ready to go to the first Christmas. And all I'm going to talk about today is chapter 1. I couldn't say. Okay. Chapter 1. And what the authors have done here is they've taken Matthew and Luke and just using verses 1 and 2 in Matthew and 1 and 2 in Luke, but I'm going to cheat and go to 3 also, and Luke, and break them up and talk about them in different ways. The first way that we're going to talk about is as pageants. Pageants. So on your little outline, I have the Matthew pageant. But before I do that, I'm going to one of the things I just love. I'm sorry, I'm going to steal some thunder. And I'm going to the genealogy in Matthew, because I think it's just loaded.
Yeah, that's my thing for next week.
That's tough. That's what you get. Okay. The genealogy in Matthew is very, very interesting, at least to me. First of all, it's broken up into 14 generations, right? 3 generations of 14. Now, everybody says, why 14? I got 2 reasons. 1, 7 people, of course, in Jesus' time, they loved numerology, right? 7 was a complete number, they said. And 2 times 7 is 14. Ah, that's 1. But I like the second one better. David. The Jews the Greeks did not have a number system. They used their alphabet. David's D, Z, D. That's David's number in Greek. Now, if you know any, I don't know much, but if you know the Greek alphabet, the first letter is alpha, right? And then we go what? Beta. And the next one is?
Gamma.
And the fourth one is? Delta. Ah. And then comes epsilon. And the sixth one is zeta. Add them up. 14, right? All based on who? David. David. Now, we take a look at that genealogy. And what's interesting to me, on my part, I don't know what you can do with it.
Not this.
Not that. Okay. So what's interesting to me, when you look at those 14, okay, one thing you'll notice is that the first 14 that you have there end with who? King David, right? Builds up to King David. The next 14, then we kind of degenerate, and the last one is when they go to what? Babylon. So they've gone David, really that kingdom, and then what happens? Exile in Babylon. Then what happens? They come back from Babylon, and we have another 14, and what do we end up with? Jesus, right? We're back up there again. Jesus. So that's kind of interesting the way that's broken up. It's all broken up, also broken up in 14, because in that day and age what they had was always oral, right? Things were given orally. And if you have it in groups of 14, it's easier to memorize. That's another reason. I read that someplace. Okay. Now, if you look at that genealogy, though, looking through, there are 4 women mentioned. 4 women. Now think about that. Matthew was written for Jews. And Jews, of course, the man was up there, right? And where were women? Woo! What did they pray? Thank you, God, that I'm not a woman. So, that was one of their prayers.
It still is.
Yes, it is.
Still is.
Okay. So, there are 4 women mentioned in here. And if you look at those 4 women, as I put it here, the women, and if you look at the genealogies, I put the women, Tamar, Joab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Out of the 4 women, 3 of them are Gentiles. 3 of them are Gentiles. And 2 of them are prostitutes. Right? Now, Bathsheba, we don't quite know whether she was Jewish or not, but we'll continue to say she's a Jew. You can do whatever you want. Okay? Now, so that's really interesting to me. That in this genealogy, 4 women. Now, genealogies were very important to the Jews. You can go to the Old Testament and you'll see genealogy after genealogy after genealogy. And the other thing is that to be a priest, what? You always have to show your genealogy and go back to Aaron if you could. And that's what you're after. And if a priest were to marry, the woman that he married, you had to go back at least 5 generations to make sure she was what? Jewish. Okay? So genealogies were very important. And to have Gentiles in that genealogy, to have women in it, you're opening up a whole new world. Matthew. But Matthew was written for the Jews. And the one thing that Matthew was trying to do was convince. Remember, Matthew was written after the 70th, right? When the temple was destroyed. And Matthew was written for the Jews, and he was trying to convince them that Christ was the Messiah. And how he did that was anything he was writing, as we go through this, he's going to have what? Things from the Old Testament. Prophecies, he's saying, from the Old Testament. To show that Christ was the Messiah. So if you go through the outline, I just talked about B, and now I'm going to go to C, scene 1. And scene 1, the authors say, is the conception of Jesus and Joseph's dilemma. So, if I go to the Bible and I look at scene 1, what we have is, starting with about verse 18, how the birth of Jesus took place. All right? Now, notice when his mother Mary had been engaged. Okay, now, engaged. The Jews had 3 steps to a marriage. 3 steps. The first step was engagement. And that was arranged by the father, right, of the groom bride. That was an arrangement. And that was an engagement. The second step, the engagement, by the way, could be broken at any time even by the woman. The second step was being betrothed. If you're betrothed, that's very important. Betrothed. It was 1 year long. And during that time, the man and the woman could live as husband and wife. But they could not have any sexual relations. But they could live 1 year together. And the only way that could be broken up was by divorce. Divorce. So, the thing that was interesting to me is this book says, this Bible book says engagement. I went to another Bible translation and it said they were what? Betrothed. I went to another and it said betrothed. And I said 2 out of 3, I'll take betrothed. Okay. So we have that. And so that Joseph is not going to divorce Mary, because first of all, it cost him lots of bucks. It cost him lots of money, no matter what they say here. And he also didn't want to, as it says in here, he didn't want to embarrass her for a bad step. So we have that. And we have the conception. And notice, this is all about Joseph. Right? Mary's mentioned once, but from then on we're going to have what? Joseph. And the reason we're going to have Joseph is written for whom? The Jews. And Joseph was descended from David. And you'll notice that he really wants to emphasize David all the way through Matthew. David's it. So we keep on going here. And if you notice then, in verse 23, here, 123, we have something from the Old Testament. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. And where is that from? You know what's interesting? To me, probably not you, but me, I went back to Isaiah 14. Because I want to say, okay, what do we have here in Isaiah 7:14, right? Anybody got it? That's what I asked you to, right? Okay. It's interesting to me just what's happening there. Isaiah 7:14. Anybody get it?
Page 623 in the Old Testament.
That's what it says, didn't it? I put page 623 there, didn't I?
Oh, you did, okay. All I have to do is read the notes.
All I have to do is read the notes, that's why.
I think-
Okay. And so what do we have there? What is happening? 7:14. And what is the title of chapter 7? Isaiah reassures who? King God. And so he's writing to the king to reassure him. And here we're pulling out what? We're pulling out that verse and saying, here, look and see what's happening. And the verse that we have. Kind of interesting. When you look at the context of these verses that Matthew has used to prove that what? Christ is the Messiah, that it was prophesied. But look at the context. Pretty clever Matthew like that. Pretty clever. But by the way, there's another thing I thought about that the Maccabees did. One of the things the Maccabees did is they started education of the boys. They started educating the boys when they were 5 years old. And what they did, they would bring them in all day, and they would have the teacher, and the teacher would read the Torah, the first 4 books, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. He would read, they would repeat it back. Read, repeat it back. Read, repeat it back. And keep reading, and he'd explain it to them. By the time they were 10, they had memorized the 5 books, if they were good. The best were kept. They went to school till they were 16. And what were they memorizing? The rest of the scriptures in the Old Testament. What do you think about that? The top ones, then, what did they do? They went with a rabbi and were taught by the rabbi. And that was the way things went. And that's where then, when they reached the point where the rabbi thought they knew and read it, they became a rabbi. And usually it was around 29 or 30 years old. How about that, kids? Right? And so they had their own. Okay, well, if we keep on going, then we know that story about the conception, right? And then we go to scene 2. The star, the wise men, and Herod. Actually, Herod really drives them for the next 2 scenes. Because old Herod, man, he was a vicious old guy. Right? Just think about Herod. Killed his first wife and 2 sons, so they wouldn't get in his way. Right? Really a great guy. So we have them, the star, and the wise men, and Herod. Now the wise men were really what? Magi, right? Magi. And they were probably from Persia. And they were priests in Persia. At one time they were really had a lot of power. But slowly they lost it, but they were still there. And of course astrology is very important. And that's why they went to Herod, and we know the story here. When they went to Herod and that star. And Herod, if we look at that, on Matthew 2:6, we have the visit of the wise men. And if we look at Matthew 2:6, what we have there is another saying from the Old Testament. And it says, "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for whom you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." And where did that come from? Well, I said that came from what? Micah, right? Chapter 5, verse 2. So, And Micah, by the way, is on what, page 849, okay? So if you look at page 849 in the Old Testament, we're going to see what old Micah does. Got it? Okay, what does it say?
It says, "For you, O Bethlehem of Ephraim, who are one of the little clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to rule in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient."
And what's the heading of that chapter?
The ruler from Bethlehem.
Okay, the ruler from Bethlehem. And if we keep reading the context, we see what that context is and how Matthew's drawing that out. To me, it's fascinating. Matthew was really quite a writer. Man, how sharp can you be? Wow. To draw these out, know your scripture, and be able to get that out to prove, try to prove, much as you can, that Christ is the Messiah. Okay, then scene 3. What do we have? The adoration of the Magi. Now what's interesting, if you look at Matthew 2:11, right? The Magi are going, and then 2:11. They're gone to Bethlehem, and what does it say? On entering the house, they've gone to Bethlehem, and they are entering a house. Not a stable. Not a stable. It's the house, right? And they entered a house, and on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and what? Myrrh. Gold. Gold is for what? Kings. It's a gift for kings. And the next one, frankincense, is a gift for priests. And myrrh is a gift for one who is to die. Okay? You take those 3 things and you put them together, and what do you have? You have actually, you encapsulate the life of Christ, right? He was a king, a priest, and then he was to what? Die. So, a lot of things here. Now,
2 minutes done.
what?
Get about 2
I
minutes.
quit.
How far down your outline did you get?
Not very far.
Have
You're
you
gonna have a lot of fun. You can just pick up and go. Well, okay. I didn't even get to Matthew. To me was much more interesting than Luke. Luke, of course, has the story that, for the most part, the one we hear the most. That old Luke, that's the one we hear the most. And but to me, I got stuck on Matthew, as you know. Because what do we have here? We have scene 4, we have their flight into Egypt, right? And they were flying into Egypt because Herod said he's going to kill what? Every baby boy, what, 2 years or younger. What do you do? We're getting out of here. So the other thing you want to notice all the time, Joseph knows all about this because of what? A dream. He's having a dream, telling him what to do. And Matthew is all about Joseph. Mary is only mentioned, what, about twice. And when you get into Luke, it's all about what? Mary. So, because Luke was written for the Gentiles. Because Luke is a what? Gentile. And Luke and Acts are the only two books written by whom? Gentile. A Gentile. Only two. The rest is all written by the Jews. All the rest. That's something we don't really think about too much. My time is up, he said.
All right. How about a big round of applause, because Mr. Newsom. He's like Dr. Science, he just knows so much. But were you gonna say something?
I was gonna say that from the time of the Maccabees, when it was a Jewish country, 68 BC, was it?
100 years.
They went out of existence. There was no independent Israel people until 1946.
Right.
Wow, that's interesting.
That's something.
They were occupied land all the time.
And they had about 103 years for it.
Yeah.
So since Don kind of stitched you to some of the Jewish roots, I think next week what I'm going to do is bring in some of the Roman imagery. So there's a blend, of course, in these gospel narratives about grabbing familiar Jewish material to reinforce Jesus' position. But there's also a lot of stuff to convince the secular people that Jesus is important. So I think next week I'll try to pick up on some of the images that are being drug in that capture the cultural Roman perspective and relate it to Jesus. And maybe to push a little harder, because I'm not a biblical literalist, as you all know, but this is really high theater that is at the front end of these stories. And to see some of the kind of ways in which the gospel writers use high theater as a projection of who they think Jesus was. So it's all written after they saw who Jesus was, and they project it back onto this verse story. So I'll do a little bit of work on that.
They did a pretty good job.
Yeah, they did a good job. But you did great, Don. I didn't know if I was going to be here this Sunday. I know I'd be in good hands with Don, and you were fantastic.
I sent you a bill.